and welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Maqbool, with you at PTV World. In today's show, we're going to be taking a look at two important stories. The first is going to be a closer look at the U.S. elections, and just a couple of days left till we find out who exactly is going to be the new U.S. president. But of course, there's a lot that is going on as a part of the race and has been for quite some time that is quite eventful, and of course gives a good lens and perspective into where the U.S. democracy lies, where the key issues are, and of course what the U.S. voters are actually voting for. So we'll be taking a look at the way that this presidential race is proceeding, with of course a very narrow margin according to polls between the two candidates, and of course at the same time the very important swing states and what exactly is going to form the decision when it comes to the voters. There is of course also the kind of rhetoric that is making part of this campaign, with of course a lot of talk just over the weekend with regards to Mr. Trump's rally in New York, which was something that made the headlines, citing the way that remarks were made, insults were made, and attacks were made at Kamala Harris, and then also with regards to immigrants, and of course the way that we've seen previously as well, racist statements coming in from not just Mr. Trump, but of course others who are part of the rally as well. At the same time, of course, we've seen the Democrats also talking about various issues, and there's been a lot of concern with regards to the economic plans that they have to offer, and of course citing the previous presidential tenure of Mr. Trump. Kamala Harris has also spoken about how he is anti-democracy and that this is not going to be good for the U.S. Whether or not that is of course the case, and whether or not the U.S. voters actually will decide accordingly, is something that remains to be seen. But we're going to be focusing on exactly what is going to be the future of these elections, or what perspectives are important when we talk about that in the domestic as well as the international sense, and how relevant then this is to countries like Pakistan and the world over, which also of course are keeping a close eye on these elections, but how much of that will really matter when it comes down to foreign policy relations. That is going to be our focus in the first segment of the show today. For this, and of course multiple discussions surrounding this, will be joined by our experts online. Our second segment is going to be focusing on what is going on in Pakistan, which of course is something very concerning of course with regards to the environment that Pakistan has been dealing with. But this is not just something that is related to floods or high temperatures. It's another aspect that we're dealing with, which affects the pollution and the air quality, and of course the lives of the people of one particular city, which is Lahore, and it is unfortunately the worst populated city. So it's number one on the list, but it's extremely hazardous to the people who are living there, and of course in the nearby areas as well. And this is mainly because of the way that a lot of agricultural waste is being burned, and because of that there is a lot of pollution in the air. There's a lot that comes in from across the border as well. But we've seen that the AQI has been recorded at 707, which is of course extremely dangerous. Above 100 is considered unhealthy, above 150 is considered very unhealthy, and above 300 is considered hazardous. So we're standing at 707, which is extremely unbelievable and obviously calls for alarm. So we'll be talking about what this means for Pakistan, particularly the Punjab government, and the efforts that need to be taken for this, and what sort of aspects can be done to control this and minimize its impact. That's going to be what we're going to take a look at the end of the show. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analysts Farrukh, Pitafi and Raja Faisal. And for our first segment regarding the U.S. elections, we've been joined by Michael Kugelman, who's Director, South Asia Institute, Wilson Center, Washington, D.C., and Professor Scott Lucas, who's a political analyst. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us, and it's been a while since we've had you on our shows, so it's good to see you once again. Michael, let me start with you with reference to what has been going on and the way that we've seen and talked about the presidential race, and there's been a lot of important aspects to it. But now we stand, of course, just a couple of days away, and we're very, very close in terms of what the opinion polls are also suggesting. But I want your take particularly on how both the candidates are being viewed at the moment, both inside the US and outside, and what sort of aspects are really going to matter at the end of the day. There's of course a lot of talk about the issues that are being raised, the language that is being used, the narrative that is being put forward, but really when it comes down to deciding who's going to be the next US president, what exactly will be the stakes there and the factors that's going to make this decision?
Yeah, thanks, Sana. Good to be back with you. It has indeed been some time. I think looking at how this election is being viewed around the world, I mean, it's hard to know where to start, but I think that if one could make one bottom line point, it would be that I think that there's a fairly strong perception that if Kamala Harris were to win the election, that we would see there would be a fair amount of continuity between the Biden administration and her own, and that would certainly, I think, apply in particular when it comes to foreign policy. I do think that it's difficult for capitals around the world, and for that matter, many Americans, to get a good read as to what her broader view on foreign policy would be. I mean, like many vice presidents, she didn't really have much of a portfolio focused on foreign policy. She's been very domestic focused. But I do think that there's a pretty strong view that one could make some fairly safe predictions as to what to expect from a Harris administration, just because I think it would be very similar to the Biden administration on many levels. Whereas if Trump were to come back and were to be president again, just a lot more difficult to predict where things would go. We do have the data point of the 4 years that he was president, but I think as we can all agree about Donald Trump, he can be very unpredictable, and we could argue that based on what he did as president, we could expect him to do X, Y, and Z if he were to return as president. And I think in a foreign policy context, what would really stand out there is his very unconventional view toward U.S. allies and partners. I mean, we know that he really uh, pursued some policies that led to some pretty serious tensions with NATO allies and treaty allies in East Asia, even as, at least initially in his term, he did some unexpected things, such as trying to forge a cordial relationship with the North Korean leader, among other things. And briefly, he even tried to pursue workable relations with China. But that's what we don't know, though, right? We don't know if he were to return as president. We don't know if he would do similar things or if he would do something completely different. So I think that the world is really not really sure what to expect. If there were to be a return of Trump, it would be a lot easier, I think, to gauge or to sort of predict what could happen if we have a Kamala Harris as president.
Right, and Professor Scott, I'd like your perspective on that as well when we talk about the two candidates. And of course, Kamala Harris is bringing her own experience and history and her role previously in the US politics. And of course, she's also a female and a Black American, and of course, with South Asian history as well. And while, of course, at the same time, we have Mr. Trump, who, of course, is being compared to not just his own previous presidential tenure, but of course also as opposed to Ms. Kamala. And so I want your take on whether or not, when we talk about that we don't know what the future role will be likely in terms of his presidency, I want your take in whether or not, when we take a look at from his previous tenure to today, is there any evolution or any inclination towards doing things differently, and how is that going to be in comparison to what he's done in the past? And then, of course, compare that also with the candidate that we have today that is standing opposite him.
I think Michael gave a very good overview in that the starting point is that with Kamala Harris, even if you're not sure about the specifics on a policy, let's say her policy towards Pakistan, the adults will be in the room. She will have experienced advisors who have the lead foreign policy position, such probably as Philip Gordon, a likely national security advisor. You also will have the rules of the game. In other words, she will work with allies as America has done in the past. She'll work with multilateral organizations as America has done in the past. And she'll look for others to do the same. With Donald Trump, you have no adults in the room. Those people that worked with Trump, tried to contain him in the first term, are gone. Indeed, two of them in the last 2 weeks have called him fascist. The former head of the military, Mike Milley, his former White House chief of staff, John Kelly. And there are no rules of the game with Trump except one, and that is what Donald Trump thinks makes him look good: transactional politics. So what will happen is that certain countries will flatter Donald Trump very quickly, as they did in 2017. We know that Saudi Arabia did this by putting a bit of gold around his neck and having him put his hands on an orb alongside King Salman and Egypt's General al-Sisi. We know that the UAE flattered him to get leverage. We know that China flattered him to get leverage, although that didn't work with the tariffs. It does in terms of his great admiration for Xi Jinping. And we know that Russia's Vladimir Putin cultivated him, of course, during the campaign, and then in 2017 by trying to get him to support Russia's takeover of part of Ukraine. And we know that Pakistan will likely try to play on that personal relationship with Trump, but so will India. And that means that all the rules of the international system, everything we're used to since 1945, those go out the window because Donald Trump prefers people who flatter him. And those who flatter him tend to be autocrats rather than allies.
Right, and that's important, and I'll take a closer look at that. But I want, Michael, your perspective first in terms of the very important aspect of how relevant these elections are internationally. And I want the perspective considering from Pakistan's lens, because there seems to be a lot of discussion around how this is going to impact us and how whoever comes as the winner from this presidential race is going to really change the way that Pakistan's trajectory is going to go. And there's a lot of debate around whether or not that is actually true. So I want your perspective, whether or not you really think that countries like Pakistan, or Pakistan in particular, are going to be impacted by who is going to sit on that seat.
Well, I mean, just because of the importance that the U.S. Has in the world, certainly any election that the U.S. has is going to have significant implications, certainly for the world and for the countries of the world too, and that includes Pakistan. I mean, I would say that I think there's to be very candid, a fair amount of bipartisan consensus here in Washington around the idea that Pakistan should not really be a strategic priority for the U.S. And so in that sense, I think that regardless of who wins this election, we're going to see a fair amount of continuity in the relationship with Pakistan, with what we've had over the last 4 years. But I think that where one could draw a line, I do think that the nature of the U.S. relationship with Pakistan could change fairly notably if Trump were to win the election. And I say that because if you look at how the relationship has been structured over the last 4 years, U.S. I think it's very clear that U.S. goals with Pakistan, U.S. interests vis-a-vis Pakistan have changed a lot since the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But you've seen a number of new areas of focus come into sharper relief in the relationship, and that includes things like clean energy and climate change. The Green Alliance framework is a big part of what the U.S. wants to do with Pakistan. However, these are issues that I don't think would be terribly appealing to a Trump administration. I don't think that a Trump administration would want climate change cooperation to be a big component of a relationship with Pakistan. But on the whole, I think Pakistan, compared to some other countries in the region, including India, I don't really see many differences between the two candidates when it comes to their views about Pakistan and how to pursue that relationship. I don't think the relationship will get any worse, irrespective of who wins the election. I don't think there'll be any major dramatic changes with it. But I think that if Trump does come back as president, I think that we could see the nature of the relationship shift a bit. I imagine he'd be maybe more inclined to focus on possibilities for expanding economic cooperation. But I think he, much like the Biden administration, would not want to do that until there's more of a sense of an idea that the economy in Pakistan is being stabilized sustainably.
Michael, does that apply on the fact that, of course, very recently we have been seeing that diplomatic outcry related to the actions of Indian diplomats, so-called diplomats in the Western countries, the way they were conducting their activities against the Khalistan movement, especially in US and then in England as well, and of course Canada. They murdered one of their leaders in Canada. So can we say that in coming future we can have a different approach towards India?
On a broad scale, no. I mean, I think it's very clear to us all that there's bipartisan consensus here in town in DC around the idea of partnering with India to counter China. But I do think the Khalistan issue looms large in this context. I think that the view in New Delhi is that if Trump were to come back as president, he would not make as much of a fuss about this whole issue compared to what Harris would do, just because of this view that it's the Democrats that tend to bring more attention to issues of rights and try to meddle more in India's domestic affairs. I don't necessarily think that's the case. And I think that if Trump were to come back and he were faced with this reality that there's very good reason to believe that India carried out an act of transnational repression on U.S. soil because of his politics, which he likes to project as nationalistic, I don't think that he could afford politically to stay quiet about something like that. So I think that the Khalistan issue will remain a tension point in the U.S.-India relationship, though I don't want to overstate how serious a tension point it is, but it will remain, I think, the core tension point in the U.S.-India relationship, regardless of who wins the election here.
Right. Scott, I'd also like your perspective on how important these foreign relations are when it comes to the U.S. voter as well. And we've seen previous elections as well when we heard a lot about how that is not significant when it comes to the U.S. voter. But I want your take now, particularly post the genocide going on in Gaza and this being a very important international issue and, of course, part of a lot of ways in which the two candidates are assessed internationally as well. How relevant that is at home in the U.S. and particularly by the Arab Americans that seem to be something of a contributing factor when it comes to the voters?
Generally, foreign policy is not a priority for Americans in presidential ballots. I think the one exception might be the post 9/11 election in 2004. I think that'll be the case here, probably with two provisos. I think one proviso has been picked up by the media, the other has not. I think the one that's been picked up by the media has been Gaza. And I think if you talk about a local effect of that specific issue, it is the question of whether Arab Americans and indeed Muslim Americans in Michigan, and Michigan has the largest Arab American population in the country, whether this will hurt the Democrats, not necessarily because Arab Americans will vote for Trump, but because they'll sit on their hands. They won't turn out, or they might vote for a third party candidate, like the Green candidate, Jill Stein. But I think apart from Michigan, I don't think Gaza is going to be as important, for example, as the economy, as immigration, as women's rights, especially reproductive rights, or Trump's threat to democracy, which we've seen highlighted in the last 24 hours. I think the other proviso, which is not being picked up, is, of course, remember, Kamala Harris is the first American candidate of South Asian descent, of Indian descent. And there's a significant Indian American community in the US. It has not been received as much attention as the Arab American community, but in an election where every vote matters, will you see support for Harris from that community? Will that happen to come out in certain swing states, such as the Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin? So those, I think, would be the two exceptions to the general rule that it's the domestic issues and Trump's threat to the US system that I think will be the priorities for voters rather than foreign policy.
Yeah, Scott, just a quick question. We all are under the impression, and it is being, of course, the narrative is being promoted that if Harris had anything to offer, why didn't she offer while she was part of the Biden administration as vice president?
And by the way, how influential, Dr. Lucas, is the post of a vice president in policy?
The Biden administration, let's be very honest here, kept Kamala Harris in the shadows for the latter part of the first term because Biden's people wanted to push him for a second term. He had said he wanted to be a one-term president. When he reversed that in 2022, then you had to promote Biden. And when they gave Harris a task, it was the thankless task, for example, of trying to deal with the immigration issue. Now, if you ask that question, why didn't she do more as part of an administration? Well, I think here there's been a negligence on the part of the US media. And I'll take two issues. I think the most important issue is women's rights, reproductive rights, but let's put this to the side. Let's talk about the economy. You've got an administration which passed some of the most economic legislation in US history, at least since the 1960s. Inflation Reduction Act, Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, Build Back Better. If you talk about green economy, you talk about technology, you talk about trying to invest in roads, bridges, broadband. This administration did that. Inflation was 9% in 2022. It's less than 3% now. GDP is growing at 3.5%. But rather than focus on that issue and what Harris would have done as part of that, we have a media focusing on what people feel. And the other issue, which is interesting because she did have a role in the immigration policy, is the fact that in 2024, the Biden administration has brought undocumented immigration across the border in 2024 is down 77%. Now, how much of that is due to the Biden administration's policies we could look at, but it's down 77%. In early 2024, the Biden administration, working with Democrats and Republicans, got the most significant border security bill, arguably in decades, in the United States. The reason that bill didn't pass was because of one person, Donald Trump. So the narrative that Harris didn't do anything, or that the Biden administration really didn't do anything, is a false narrative. But you've got a US media which has been really, until the last 24, 48 hours, has been really negligent on covering issues and has been led along more by the spectacle of Donald Trump.
Right. Farrukh, I want your perspective on these issues as well,
Yeah.
and particularly in light of what all has transpired in the last couple of days, particularly over the weekend, as well. A lot of these issues, of course, were part of also the headlines from the rally in New York by Mr. Trump, and of course are important and integral to this discussion. But I want your perspective on how significant they will be when it comes to the swing states, or the voters that will actually make the decision or have previously historically made the decision of the US election. Will this be something that will be part of this particular decision? You said earlier in one of the episodes that we spoke about the US elections that we have the Democrats who are of course going to vote for the Democrats, and we have the Republicans who are going to vote for the Republicans, and it's not like the two candidates are trying to get in the other side. So what really is then the focus of this race right now?
Right. Very interesting questions. And before that, I just very quickly wanted to actually comment on two things that were discussed. One regarding Trump's foreign policy and what exactly will happen to Pakistan, US relations. One thing is for sure, Pakistan's relationship with the US has always been transactional. Now, the amazing thing about Donald Trump is that everybody else's relationship is also going to be transactional. So welcome to the world of Pakistan, dear world. But regarding overall situation when it comes to foreign policy, I don't think that I'm going to disagree with my friend Michael Kugelman that Kamala Harris is going to present continuation of policies. I think that there is going to be a significant change in at least one war, and that is Ukraine's war. I don't think that nowadays the kind of shifts that are coming, and especially whatever was happening during BRICS time as well, the US will try to actually ensure, no matter who is in power, the new government, if Kamala Harris comes to power, it is going to be a reset. So there is going to be some kind of reconciliation, at least this is what I see. And it holds true for Trump, it holds true for Harris also. Now, regarding your question about Madison Square Garden speech, back in 1940s when Hitler was in power in Germany, at that time there was a Nazi rally that was held in Madison Square Garden. So there were comparisons with that beforehand, before this event was happening. And unfortunately, Democrats have not learned one thing, and that is whatever they are going to use against Trump, whenever Republicans come into power, they are going to use the same tactics against them. So there is this comedian who is actually mostly into roasting, right? So he's when you roast somebody, your attitude is mostly abusive. So there's this podcaster comedian who does this Kill Tony podcast, and he is there and he's talking stuff about various places, and all of a sudden media seems to be outraged. The more you are outraged, more it is going to feed into the machine that supports Donald Trump. So at least calm down. There isn't, sky is not falling, right? And by the way, Donald Trump is not Hitler, whatever he might be. But now, given that there has been discussion about three core issues, right? One, economy, very important. The second one is southern border, whether you like it or not, whether you subscribe to Donald Trump's version of things that illegal immigrants are eating the dogs and eating the cats, right, and eating the pets. But regardless of that, the fact is that there is a concern regarding illegal immigrants. And there is, because in California, elsewhere, there is also, this is also feeding into the homeless situation. That is, homeless crisis is a big one as well. So it becomes a massive issue, right? And the third one, and amazingly, Michael Moore, somebody who actually predicted correctly the outcome of 2016 and 2020, right? He said something very interesting recently in an interview, and he predicted that there is going to be an avalanche, there is going to be a tsunami of women who want to protect women's rights, right? Especially reproductive rights. So it's crazy how things are, but Ali Hochschild has actually written a book called Stranger in Strange Lands, in which she talks about an empathy wall. An empathy wall that divides two sides and people cannot actually access the other side. So there seems to be an empathy wall there. And amazingly, when you look at the national averages and when you look at the battleground state averages, Sana, most of the differences are very minute. They are lesser than margin of error. So what happens is that no matter what, you cannot rely on those opinion polls on either of these issues, right? So we don't know what exactly is going to happen. Of course, there's always an anti-incumbency issue, but then there's this women issue, which is very serious. And I think that Kamala Harris has done, her campaign has done incredibly well in honing this sentiment. And I think that it is going to have some kind of, interesting outcome.
Absolutely. And Michael, I also want your take in terms of how all of these discussions around what these two candidates are presenting is also affecting or impacting the way that different countries are looking at this, particularly in terms of the way that we have seen the relationship that has grown as part of the previous presidential tenure as well. So countries like India that you've already discussed, but also like Russia and their take on what exactly will be the future when it comes to US-Russia relations. And I want your perspective on that in terms of what you think the Russian government is really looking towards when it comes to the candidates, and which candidate would they actually prefer?
And Michael, if you can allow me as well, when it comes to Trump being considered as someone who does not believe in war, and he wants the rapid sort of solutions to all of the conflicts which are going on, is it true that if Trump comes in the Oval Office, he will make sure, as he claimed previously, that Ukraine crisis is a matter of 10 minutes or an hour?
And by the way, building on that, Michael, let me add to this. America has had these rounds where once the country goes for isolationism, of course, Monroe Doctrine and whatnot, and then there are years of engagement. Given the record of both Donald Trump and President Biden's decisions of disengaging from various countries where they had military deployment, do you think that America might be moving towards, overall, consensus-wise, towards isolationism now?
Yeah, thanks. A lot of great points there. Let me take your last question first. I think one of the big stories in U.S. foreign policy in recent years has been this unsuccessful attempt to pivot away from the Middle East and focus more attention and allocate more resources, diplomatic, economic, and indeed perhaps military, to Asia, to the Indo-Pacific. I think that there's no president, I think, that would want to be fighting wars. There's no U.S. president that would want to be fighting wars or being involved in wars in the Middle East. But I think we've seen with developments over the last year plus that it's just very difficult for the U.S. to move away from the Middle East. And of course, now the U.S. is not actively involved at a kinetic level in any of the conflicts playing out across the Middle East. But it's been very difficult for it to refocus and pivot to Asia, so to speak. That's been one of the big storylines, and I think it'll continue to be a big storyline once we have our next president. I don't think that any president, including Trump, would want to implement a policy of strict isolationism, though certainly Trump's historic view of alliances suggests that he would want the U.S. to be less involved in global affairs than it has been in the past. And if past is precedent, he would also want to see top U.S. allies doing more in terms of ponying up money, providing more support for these longstanding alliances of which the U.S. has been a part, such as NATO. But I don't think that Trump would want to pull back completely. And let's remember, when he was president previously, he was very active in so many different aspects of global affairs. And one thing that stands out is the fight against Islamic State. That was a big priority for his administration. So to the Russia question, you talk about what the Russian government thinks. If we're talking about what the Russian government thinks, we're really talking about Putin. I don't know of anyone that can get in Putin's head other than himself. So it's very difficult to know what he's thinking. But I'll just briefly say that I think that he is perhaps one of several world leaders that might be holding off on taking what could be very consequential policy steps until they know who the president is. If Putin is contemplating, expanding his war, which I don't think he would actually do, if China might be thinking about provocations that it might consider staging in the Indo-Pacific, it might want to hold. I think that there's a view that it's useful to hold back and see who becomes president here, because of a view that depending on who it is, there might be a certain level of receptivity to some of these actions. Conventional wisdom is that Trump has a more restrained and friendly view to Russia than the Democrats do. And if that's the case, obviously, that would have major implications for the U.S. relationship with Russia, and for that matter, the U.S. relationship with India and other countries that have close partnerships with Russia, even while they try to pursue good relations with the United States as well. But I'll end by saying, we may think that we know what Donald Trump would do because he might have done this as president, but if he comes back as president again, things could be very different. He could take a very different position. We just don't know.
Professor Scott, when we look at these speeches which were made by, of course, Donald Trump in past and in recent past, I'm talking about, he's been hurling many statements related to deep state of US. And he's been claiming that, of course, the previous victory of Biden, deep state was behind it. And now Harris is the new face of the deep state. And here we are fighting against the deep state, and people who've been involved previously against his party, of course, he would take them to cleaners. And this is the narrative he's been promoting. Do you believe that he is actually garnering votes in terms of, anti-deep state narrative? And if so, what is the future of the deep state?
Professor Scott, I hate to actually add to your burden, but because we are talking about statements from Trump, one very interesting thing happened, and that was his interview with Joe Rogan. I'm sure everybody has seen it. For 3 hours he sat down and he spoke. Did you notice any discrepancy between whatever is being attributed to his public addresses and whatever he was saying to Joe Rogan? Because there seemed to be some measure of moderation in that interview.
In the Joe Rogan interview, he was playing to an audience, especially of young males. He repeated the same lies about the 2020 election. He repeated his climate change denial. He repeated his insults. He may have delivered it in a slightly different tone because he was in a friendly interview environment with Joe Rogan, but it was standard Trump. But I want to take my analyst hat off and just speak to you as a native of America. When I watched the Madison Square Garden rally, and I'm going to answer your question that you've talked about with Trump's language in this way, I was frightened this morning. I think for the first time I was really frightened, and let me tell you why. It wasn't just this so-called comedian, this podcaster who called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. There were statements made at that rally that sexual slurs, horrible sexual slurs about Hispanic voters, even as Trump is supposedly courting Hispanic voters. There were insults of blacks, even as Trump was supposedly courting black votes. Even as Trump was supposedly courting Arab American votes, there was a horrible statement about Palestinians made by Rudy Giuliani. Kamala Harris was called a prostitute. She was called Satan. She was called the Antichrist by someone wielding a crucifix. Far from distancing himself from those remarks, Donald Trump doubled down on them. And Donald Trump repeated, and this is about your question on the deep state, Donald Trump repeated his threat to use the military against enemies within. Donald Trump has manufactured the deep state as part of his way of saying, if you're a Democrat, if you're a so-called radical, if you're extremist, if you're in a U.S. agency and you do not accept my actions, you do not accept my language, I will get you. And it's not just statements from Donald Trump that we saw in Madison Square Garden. Project 2025, that 900-page document, is to try to take control of the U.S. agencies and make them bend to the will of Donald Trump. I will not use the word fascist with Donald Trump, although John Kelly has used it, his former White House Chief of Staff. Mark Milley, the former head of the American military, has used it. But I will say that Trump is a wannabe authoritarian. And even if he is too chaotic or incoherent, being an authoritarian, he will try to do that. You can either choose Donald Trump or you can choose the U.S. system. You cannot choose both.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Scott Lucas and Michael Kugelman, for joining us. We're going to end it here. That's all we have time for. But thank you very much for sharing your insights about the U.S. elections and, of course, the way that the presidential race is continuing. And this is, of course, really important given the current dynamics and how we move forward as well. Yes, Farrukh, you want to add something?
Right. Regarding those statements that Professor Lucas was actually referring to, I did not hear them. This is obnoxious, of course. If those words were spoken. I was referencing to something that was actually magnified by the media. But having said that, John Oliver has actually made a beautiful episode once again. He's a brilliant man. I think his contribution to democracy, right from identifying for Project 2025 to his recent episode where he talks about new slogan of Republicans. Remember in 2016, the Republican slogan was ban Muslims, right? This time it is, mass deportation. And the kind of actually picture he has presented is frightening. And this is the problem, that Donald Trump might be this relatable guy who's a celebrity, but along with him come so many Looney Tunes. And it becomes so difficult for Steve Miller, who's actually openly talking about people that you have grown up with, and the immigrants who don't look like you, right? This kind of anti-immigrant sentiment, especially because Steve Miller is Benjamin Netanyahu's shill, and Steve Bannon is India's shill. So with that kind of people, the biggest problem is the kind of world that you're going to create will be terrible. So in the end, the argument once again is Kamala Harris is, I hope, and I think the way media is going crazy trying to prove that she's not winning, it shows that she might be winning, but they want you to be distressed and convinced that she cannot, and then stay away from elections.
Right. We're now going to talk about our next segment, which focuses on the city of Lahore in Pakistan and the AQI there. And Faisal, I want your perspective on that first in terms of the AQI being 707. Of course, we all know is extremely hazardous. Is in fact way beyond the hazardous line of 300 points. And this is not something new. It's not something that has started today. We've been actually looking at this over the past couple of years now. And this is important, particularly in terms of the lives of the people and how it affects the country. And while, of course, there are certain measures that have been taken place by the Punjab government with regards to effects to minimize the pollution, what really can be done in terms of controlling the current situation and to look at new innovative ways to deal with this?
Yes, Sana, disaster, and of course it is alarming situation right now related to one of the largest cities of Pakistan, and it happens to be one of the largest cities of the world as well in terms of population. And sadly, I mean, if we look at the trainings which were provided by the agriculture sector to the people at large, to of course how to contain the weed that they get out of their lands, and they simply burn it, and that becomes part of our environment. If it doesn't happen here inside the Pakistan, you don't have the parameter to check where it is actually originating from. Same is the case with India as well. I mean, Lahore is next door to India, and Indian side, it's full of farmers as well, and they have the same practice, and of course they are contributing towards it as well. Whether it is coming from that side or this side, from here it is going towards the New Delhi side, both of the cities, they are obviously making records when it comes to pollution. And gone are the days when obviously fog used to be considered as a very pleasant feeling when you are walking around and you feeling the fog. But now it's smog.
Fog is different than smog.
Yeah, now it's smog. And it is obviously directly affecting the life circle of all of the living beings. And I think government has done enough, still is doing, and there is more to do. Of course, experts, they need to be hired related to this, how to contain it. Not only this side, but of course on the other side as well. I always say there might be matters where of course Pakistan and India can't talk to each other and sit together, but there are that needs to be sorted out as well. To me, I think.
But you think they can do it on this?
They should do it. They should do it.
But we're
from both sides.
But we still need to control this pollution-causing aspect in Lahore, in our own home.
But at the same time, Sana, it is, I mean, the air we are sharing with India. And when it comes to Delhi and Lahore, both of them are getting affected. And what I believe is, if not on the higher level, but at least the mayor level contributions should be made from both sides. Both of the sides, they need to, of course, make sure that this factor of smog is being dealt with by both of the sides as a city to city collaboration, if not country to country.
Absolutely. And Farrukh, I want on your perspective also on this in terms of the solutions, but also in terms of whether or not we unfortunately of course have seen that perhaps much more integral issues are something that are missing on the table, and while of course this is very, very important, but unfortunately hasn't taken the kind of priority internationally, or perhaps especially with our relationship with the neighbor that Faisal was mentioning. I want your take then on what exactly can we look at in terms of the approach that we want to take. Do we just look at the fact that we need to talk to India about this, so that we can do something about it ourselves?
Right, Sana. Before that, two observations on a lighter note. Every time Faisal talks about smog and the way he says smog, actually immediately reminds me of Tolkien's Hobbit instead of anything else, right? Remember there was a dragon there called Smog. But apart from what he, apart from that, what he was saying, that both sides need to come together because they share the same air. I mean, there's this Indian song in which it is one line is "Meri saadgi dekh main kya chahta hu." Look at my simplicity. What am I demanding? Right? These are two countries which are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, and they don't realize that their radioactivity is going to carry it to the other side. Yeah. That is their own. Yeah. These are two countries which are fighting at the glacial level, one of the highest war zones, because they cannot actually decide when to disengage and evacuate, right? And because of that, they are actually abusing climate, right? With that kind of hostility, do you honestly think that they are going to sit together and talk about these matters? Now, after this kind of rebuttal, I'm going to agree with Faisal regarding one aspect, and that is, which country is more advanced, Sana? Pakistan or India? Which one has more booming economy, India or Pakistan, right? In India, there are more, not only farms there are also factories, right? And because of the kind of pollution, and this carries to Delhi also, it is coming our ways as well. And you can't actually stop it. You can't have any air, purifiers set up in the middle. And then, of course, last year I was in Lahore in these days, and trust me, I couldn't see even beyond 2 feet. It was such a bad smog, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, has Lahore's air been purer in the past? I don't think so. There are 2 reasons. One, factories, and they have also been very poisonous in the past. And then you also have the issue of bad vehicles. And if you have driven in Lahore, you go crazy, because they can actually drive not only from right or left, over you and under you as well.
Absolutely.
So with
that's another issue for another day.
with that kind of traffic and then vehicles being subpar, it becomes a huge contribution to this pollution. So we'll have to crack down on all these issues and then talk to the deaf neighbor as well.
Great. Thank you, Farrukh, and thank you, Faisal, for joining us in the debate. As always, that's all that we have time for. We'll now see you tomorrow.